So thank you for being here to have this time together to think about some pretty deep things about what the Buddha taught and what it might mean to us today, dealing with the world that we're faced with. We spent a lot of time together over the years looking at the early Buddhist texts, looking at what the Buddha taught, thinking each of us about how that relates to the challenges that face us every day in our personal lives. And then we also from time to time look at the way that bigger picture things happening in the bigger world are affecting all of us. And looking at whether or not the Buddha's teachings hold up to that level of suffering that really is so pervasive and so just so big. Looking at that is an ongoing thing, unlike in the newspapers where it seems to kind of come and go as a subject. These kind of things don't stop happening because the spotlight isn't on them, and we know that. So the kind of suffering that rises to this level of trauma is a regular thing in life for people. This is why the Buddha taught what the Buddha taught. You know, the lump showing up on the mammogram, the sexual assault, when a hand goes up your skirt and you're just trying to climb the stairs to get to the bathroom at work, not bothering anybody, but these things happen, and they are terrifying and horrifying. In that sense that something that is so bad that it's really unthinkable, it cannot be, but it is. That's what trauma is. And there's also the trauma that hasn't happened to us personally yet, but we know that it's happening to others. You know, the fires consuming towns all around the world, and right now in the United States, in California. And some of you may know that the Bhikkhuni monastery, Aloka Vihara, just barely escaped being consumed in fire last night, the Khandra fire. It's just moments away, and everybody's been evacuated to Sacramento, and they're waiting, apparently, from the post on Suda Central. Nighttime is the most dangerous time because that's when the winds blow in a way that is blowing the fires towards the Vihara. So these are the nuns that we've been following for a while now, part of the group of nuns that are working to reestablish the Bhikkhuni Sangha. So they personally mean a lot to a lot of people. So this knowing about trauma is itself traumatizing. And so it really, I think it behooves us to understand the way trauma affects us, because we're being affected whether we know it or not. The effects still happen, whether we can name the effects or not. For those of us who have experienced trauma in our personal lives already, what I'm saying is going to be all too familiar. And I understand that once you've gone through something that's that level of suffering, just to hear about it is just adding on what's already way too big a pile. So everyone should please feel free to step away at any time. You don't have to stay listening to this talk. I'm recording it so you can go back and listen to bits and pieces anytime. You can just turn down the volume, take a few breaths. Look around the room and remind yourself that things are okay now. Yeah. That the Buddha gave us a really lovely teaching. That can also support our ability to stay present without harming ourselves when we open to the harm that's being done to ourselves and to others on the level that's being done now with the climate catastrophes that we're seeing. So I'm going to invite some practice. This practice is really beautifully supported in a particular discourse that I'm not going to read today because time is pretty short, but it's the numerical discourse 10.219. And the discourse looks at the through line is a concern around karma, really, around how we develop in a way that we no longer suffer from the results of our own bad actions. And in the course of investigating that question, the discourse gives us a practice on the four Brahma Viharas. So just to mention a couple of things. The word for this practice that's used in the discourse is a word we see often in the early texts, which is the word vihara. This practice is to be done as a vihara. Sometimes it's translated as abiding. So these are the four Brahma Viharas, divine abidings. In his translation of the numerical discourses, Bhikkhu Bodhi this time translates it as dwell, to dwell in this practice. And Bhante Sujato has chosen, for reasons that he discusses, and he really thought about, he's chosen to use the word meditation instead of either abiding or dwelling. I like abiding and dwelling because for me, meditation is just so associated with how I learned to meditate, which was as something relatively brief, a half an hour sit in the beginning was long. Meditation was something to do, sort of like flossing your teeth or doing your yoga workout as something, as an activity during the day that's meaningful and important. But the vihara and the dwelling, to me, has more of that sense of abiding in the practice through the day. Some place that you really settle into, and it's where you live. And in this particular discourse, as in every case, I have run into where these four are taught together, and they almost always are. Metta is taught on its own, but almost always they're taught together, and they're taught in the same order, always. It never changes up. And it begins with the practice of metta. So we're to cultivate goodwill in our hearts. First we settle in. With the support of our practice, as much as we can, we let go of all of the sources of grasping and aversion. And just for this time, we're here to practice. And this instruction directs us to, in every direction, all four directions, around, above, and below, to offer loving kindness, that is of the nature, it's of the quality that it is abundant, it's exalted, and it's immeasurable. So there's this vastness, this non-discrimination in all directions, everywhere, to all beings. Offering goodwill. But Bhante Sujato translates metta as love. And maybe it is time we reclaim that word for something bigger than the trivialities it's been used for so much in contemporary culture, and the hypocrisies it's been used for in some religious contexts. Love that is abundant, love that is exalted, love that is immeasurable. When we dwell in that mind, then we're transformed. So when we meet suffering, there's no aversion, there's no ill will, and there's no turning away. We look it fully in the face. We understand what it means that the fire is moving down the mountainside. We understand what it means for all the life that's there. Without aversion, with a heart that is full of immeasurable love, we understand and we see. And this is the practice of the second of the four divine dwellings. This is compassion. Can we make our hearts big enough to hold all the suffering that's there to be seen now? Can we make our hearts big enough to meet with compassion all the suffering we understand is yet to come? Even in the best case scenario, which still doesn't seem to be where we're heading yet, but that could turn on a dime. When George Floyd was murdered in front of our eyes by a police officer, enough people saw what happened. Enough people showed up and spoke and continue to speak and continue to speak today. This cannot happen anymore. And there is rejoicing in seeing that people can do that. We can come together in love to witness suffering, to show up with kindness, to say whatever it takes in kindness. No more. Stop. And the practice of rejoicing in our own goodness, in the goodness of other people, and maybe even most of all, sometimes in the gift of the Buddha's teachings, as they do again and again at the end of every discourse, rejoicing and going to practice what the Buddha taught. This is the third Brahmavihara, extending that rejoicing in every direction, above and below, immeasurable. And we are to dwell in this rejoicing. We are to make much of it. The fourth of the divine abidings is equanimity. And equanimity is what we find when we understand what the Buddha taught. In the Buddha's wisdom, all beings are going to be dealing with the consequences of our choices, no matter how much we wish otherwise sometimes, no matter how big those consequences are. Bringing love and understanding, this is what the Buddha taught. This is suffering. This is the cause of suffering. This is the path to the end of suffering. And each of us makes our choices every day, moment by moment. And the consequences of those choices belong to us. Equanimity is what happens when love meets wisdom. Equanimity that's big enough to see everything that's there to be seen without aversion, without greed, and with maybe just a teeny little bit of delusion. It's hard to get rid of all of that, even in a moment. And we extend that equanimity in every direction, above and below. And then we show up And then we see what our next choice is going to be. Let's sit together for a moment.